In a farmhouse somewhere in Normandy in the summer of 1944, a German intelligence officer sat down with a captured American tactical document and began to translate it line by line. This was standard procedure. Captured documents were valuable. They revealed how the enemy organized, how they thought, what they prioritized. The Germans were good at this kind of analysis, methodical, thorough, precise. They had been reading enemy documents for 5 years. But this one was different. This one didn't make sense. The document described how American infantry squads were trained to advance on enemy positions. It described the relationship between the soldiers who fired and the soldiers who moved. It described the pace of movement, the volume of fire, the specific role of each man in the squad. It was detailed. It was clear, and what it described to the officer reading it in that farmhouse looked like a system designed to get American soldiers killed. He read it again. He checked his translation. He read it a third time. Then he made a single annotation in the margin, in pencil, underlined once. The word, roughly translated, was deliberate. The Americans were not making a mistake. They were not advancing upright into German machine gun fire out of ignorance or panic or some cultural inability to take the battlefield seriously. They were doing it on purpose. There was a method behind it, and the method this officer had just realized with something that contemporary accounts describe as genuine unease was working. This is the story of that method. Where it came from, why it worked, what it demanded of the men who used it, and why, in one terrible stretch of forest in the autumn of 1944, it stopped working entirely, and what happened when it did. Every army that fought the Second World War had learned the same lesson from the first one. The dominant weapon on any infantry battlefield was the machine gun. A single machine gun, properly sighted, with a clear field of fire and an adequate supply of ammunition, could stop an entire battalion in its tracks. The Franco-British offensives of 1916 had established this in the most expensive possible way. Hundreds of thousands of men had walked across open ground toward machine gun positions and been cut down. And the lesson that every general and every private had absorbed from that catastrophe was identical. When a machine gun opens up on you, you go to ground. You get your body below the line of fire. You find cover. You stay small and you stay still, and you wait for your own fire to suppress the gun before you try to move again. This instinct was so deeply embedded in military training by 1944 that it was essentially reflex. Every army on every front drilled it into its soldiers from the first week of basic training. Get down, find cover, return fire, wait. The German army by 1944 had organized its entire infantry doctrine around this understanding. The primary weapon of the German infantry squad was not the rifle, it was the machine gun. Specifically, by Normandy, it was the MG-42, one of the most ferocious light automatic weapons ever built. It fired somewhere between 1,200 and 1,500 rounds per minute, a rate so fast that individual shots blurred into a continuous tearing sound that American soldiers described universally as a buzzsaw. A single MG-42 team, 2 men, the gunner and the loader, could lay down more suppressive fire than an entire American rifle platoon. German infantry squads were organized around their machine gun teams. The riflemen existed primarily to protect the gun and to exploit the opportunities the gun created. The gun was the squad's primary weapon. Everything else was secondary. The tactical logic was sound. If you could suppress your enemy, pin them to the ground, force them to keep their heads down, deny them the ability to aim, you controlled the battlefield. A suppressed enemy couldn't move, couldn't maneuver, couldn't coordinate. They could only wait, and while they waited, you moved your own forces into position to destroy them. This doctrine had worked brilliantly for the Germans in Poland, in France in 1940, in the early phases of the Russian campaign. German machine gun teams were well-trained, well-led, and genuinely effective. They understood fire and movement at the squad level better than almost any other army on Earth in 1939. The problem was that by 1944, they were about to encounter an army that had studied their doctrine, understood it, and built a specific counter to it from the ground up. The American way of fighting infantry combat had been rebuilt almost entirely between 1940 and 1944, and the man most responsible for the specific piece of it that was baffling German intelligence officers was not initially a famous general. He was a collection of training manuals, a reformed officer education system, and several 100,000 soldiers who had spent months in England and the United States learning something that most of them thought when they first encountered it was completely insane. The core insight was this: the German machine gun doctrine worked because it assumed that its targets would respond to suppressive fire the way every army since 1916 had responded, by going to ground and staying there. If the targets went to ground and stayed there, the machine gun controlled the battlefield. But what happened if the targets didn't go to ground? What happened if they kept moving? A machine gunner firing at a moving target is doing something fundamentally different from a machine gunner firing at a stationary one. A stationary target doesn't require aim adjustment. You find your range, you walk your fire onto the target, and you hold it there. The target's options are to die, to move, or to suppress your gun. A moving target requires continuous adjustment. You have to lead the movement, anticipate direction changes, recalculate range as the distance closes. And if that moving target is also firing at you, not aimed precision fire, but volume fire, rounds going in your general direction in sufficient quantity that keeping your head up becomes actively dangerous, your ability to properly aim your weapon degrades dramatically. This was the fundamental logic of American fire and movement doctrine. Not the specific tactic itself, which every army used in some form, but the specific application of it. The insistence that both elements, the element providing suppressing fire and the element moving forward, should be doing so simultaneously, aggressively, and at a pace that denied the enemy time to adjust. The tactic had a formal name in the manuals. It was called fire superiority, and the doctrine around it was direct. You achieved fire superiority before you moved, and you maintained it while you moved, and the moment you lost it was the moment you stopped moving and the moment you started dying. The key word was maintained, not established and then allowed to lapse while your assault element crossed open ground. Maintained continuously at the same time as the assault, so that the German gunner on the receiving end of it never had a moment where he could safely raise his head and aim. The squad organization the Army had developed to execute this was built around it. By 1942, the American Infantry Rifle Squad had been expanded from 8 men to 12, and those 12 were organized into 2 fire teams of 6 men each. One team provided the suppressive fire, the other moved. Then they switched. The squad's automatic weapon, the Browning automatic rifle, the BAR, was the cornerstone of the suppressive element. The BAR fired significantly slower than the MG-42. It was not, in a straight technical comparison, as powerful a suppressive weapon, but there was one of them per fire team, which meant there were 2 bars in a 12-man squad, which meant that a single American squad could provide overlapping automatic fire from 2 different positions simultaneously while also moving riflemen forward, and the mathematics of that, 2 separate sources of automatic fire, both firing, both requiring the German gunner to track and respond, were considerably different from the mathematics of one machine gun facing a stationary enemy. None of this was immediately obvious. None of it felt right when you were the man being asked to keep walking toward a gun that was firing at you. Every instinct, every self-preservation mechanism in the human body screamed to get down, to get flat, to get small, to let the earth absorb the rounds that were meant for you. American infantry training in 1943 and 1944 was explicitly, deliberately designed to override that instinct, not by removing it, which would have been impossible and probably not even desirable, but by replacing it with a trained response that was stronger. The feeling was still there. You still wanted to hit the dirt. You kept walking anyway because you had drilled the alternative until the drilling was more powerful than the feeling. It took months. It was not popular with the men being trained. It required a level of trust in a tactical system that was, to anyone encountering it fresh, deeply counterintuitive. And when those men got to Normandy and used it in actual combat against actual German machine gun positions, enough of them survived the experience to begin believing that the insane thing the Army had made them practice actually worked.
George Patton had been thinking about this problem for years before Normandy. He had been a cavalryman in his professional instincts long after cavalry became obsolete, and what cavalry had always understood, what the horse had always given soldiers that the trench had taken away in 1914, was speed. Speed was protection. A stationary target was a dead target. A moving target forced a gunner to lead his shot, to account for velocity and direction, to work harder for every kill. The trench had taken away speed, and the trench had produced the Western Front, and Patton's entire career after 1918 had been devoted to finding the way back to mobility as the primary mode of warfare. Tanks had given him one answer. Marching fire gave him another. Marching fire, as Patton formalized it for Third Army in the summer of 1944, was an intensification of the fire and movement doctrine the Army had been building. It was not enough, in Patton's conception, for the moving element to advance while the suppressing element fired. The moving element should also fire. Everyone should be firing. The entire assault force should be walking forward and shooting simultaneously, putting rounds down range not in any particular direction, not aimed fire designed to hit a specific target, but volume fire, designed to create an environment in which anyone with a weapon trained on you could not safely use it. The marching fire assault looked, from any distance, like something between disciplined training and a mob. A line of men walking forward, rifles at the hip, firing continuously, not stopping, not getting down, not seeking cover. The noise was extraordinary. The volume of fire coming from an advancing American company using marching fire doctrine was enough to make coherent aimed fire from the opposite direction genuinely difficult. Not because every round was landing somewhere dangerous, but because the accumulation of them, the constant crack of rounds passing overhead, the dust and debris they kicked up, the sheer acoustic weight of them, pressed German soldiers down behind their positions and kept them there while the Americans closed the distance. Patton's argument, stated in various forms across his addresses to Third Army before and after the Normandy breakout, was ruthlessly simple. The kill zone in front of any defensive position was lethal. The longer you spent in the kill zone, the more likely you were to die. The fastest way through the kill zone was to walk through it without stopping. The safest way to walk through it was to be firing continuously, so that anyone trying to shoot you from the other side had to keep his head down. The most dangerous thing you could do in the kill zone was to stop and get down, because stopping extended the time you spent in the worst possible place. The instinct to go to ground felt like safety. It was not safety. It was the slowest possible way to die. This argument was not universally accepted, even among Patton's own officers. It required men to act against the deepest available human instinct in the worst possible circumstances, in the presence of genuine, immediate danger. It required trust in a system that had to be proven right repeatedly before the men using it were willing to believe it. And it required a specific kind of training that the Army had spent years building, and that in the specific circumstances of the summer of 1944 was paying off in ways that were becoming visible not only in American after-action reports, but in the intelligence documents of the Army they were fighting.
The German officer corps by 1944 was not comprised of stupid men. They had won extraordinary victories in the first 4 years of the war, using a system of tactical thinking that had produced some of the most brilliant small unit combat the modern era had seen. They were not losing in Normandy because they didn't understand war. They were losing, in part, because the army they were fighting had built something specific to defeat the thing they did best. The MG-42 was a devastating weapon when you went to ground in front of it. The German defensive doctrine, built around the machine gun, organized to suppress enemy movement and then counterattack into the suppressed position, worked perfectly when the enemy did what suppressed infantry were supposed to do. When American units kept moving, the calculation broke down in specific ways that German after-action reports noted with increasing frequency and frustration across the summer and autumn of 1944. The first problem was the volume of fire coming from advancing American squads. The MG-42 was an extraordinary weapon, but it required its gunner to be able to raise his head and use his sights, and a squad advancing with 2 BARs firing and 8 riflemen also firing created an environment in which raising your head above a defensive position was a genuinely dangerous activity. It wasn't that the fire was accurate, it often wasn't. It was that the density of it, the number of rounds passing through the space above a German defensive position per second, made staying up long enough to aim a disciplined return shot increasingly costly. The second problem was the pace. German defensive doctrine anticipated that suppressed infantry would stop moving while suppressed. Stopping gave the defensive position time to adjust, to shift fire, to call for support, to do all the things a prepared defensive position was designed to do. American infantry that kept walking gave the defensive position much less time to do any of those things. The distance closed faster. The moment at which the advancing soldiers were close enough to use grenades came faster. The moment at which the defensive position became untenable, too close, too much fire, too many men in too many directions at once, came faster. The third problem, and the one that appears most consistently in German accounts of fighting Americans in this period, was psychological. There is something specifically demoralizing about an enemy that does not respond to fire the way every military instinct says he should. When you open fire on a group of soldiers and they go to ground, you have confirmed the basic transaction of the battlefield. Fire is dangerous. Fire changes behavior. Fire controls movement. When you open fire on a group of soldiers and they keep walking toward you, something more unsettling happens. The enemy has failed at its primary purpose. The enemy has absorbed the fact of it and kept coming. The psychological weight of that, of an enemy that your best weapon has not stopped, is disproportionate to the tactical reality. It produces hesitation. It produces doubt. And hesitation and doubt in the split-second decisions of close-range infantry combat are often the difference between a defensive position that holds and one that breaks. This was the thing that the German intelligence officer in that Normandy farmhouse had noticed and had written a single underlined word about. The Americans weren't walking into fire because they were brave in some simple, unconsidered way. They weren't walking into fire because they didn't understand what was happening. They were walking into fire because someone had worked out years earlier that walking into fire while also firing was more survivable than going to ground in front of it, and had built an entire system of training and squad organization to make that insight executable. The deliberateness of it was what mattered, not the courage, which could be explained and even discounted, the system behind it. Systems were harder to defeat than courage.
It is worth spending a moment with what this cost. The tactical logic was real, and it worked often enough to vindicate the doctrine. The psychological cost to the men executing it was something else entirely, and it deserves honesty. Walking upright toward a machine gun is not a natural act. It is not something the human nervous system accepts willingly. The accounts of American infantrymen who fought in France and Germany in 1944 and 1945 are full of the specific texture of that experience. The way the sound of an MG-42 registered in the body before the mind had processed it. The fight against the instinct to drop. The discipline required to keep moving when everything in you was screaming to find the earth. Men who did it describe a specific quality of dissociation, a kind of forcing of the will over the body that was exhausting in a way that had nothing to do with physical exertion. You could rest from marching. You could not rest from the ongoing effort of overriding your own survival instinct in the presence of incoming fire. The officers who led these assaults bore a specific additional weight. They were the men the soldiers were watching, not just for tactical instruction, but for confirmation that the thing they were being asked to do was survivable. An officer who hesitated, who flinched, who sought cover at the wrong moment, communicated to every soldier watching him that the instinct was right and the training was wrong. The officers who held the line, who kept walking when walking was what the situation required, were doing something that required not just physical courage, but a sustained act of will that had to be performed in front of an audience that included both their own men and the men trying to kill them. The casualty rates among American junior officers in this period were extremely high. Lieutenants led from the front because the doctrine required it, and because the squad-level tactics they were executing demanded physical presence rather than radio management. They died in correspondingly high numbers. The system worked partly because it was designed to keep functioning when officers died. The squad was organized around sergeants who could execute the same tactics without waiting for direction. But the human cost of that design was paid by the lieutenants whose job it was to demonstrate daily that you could lead men toward machine gun fire and bring enough of them through to take the position. The men who survived this repeatedly developed a specific relationship with risk that those who observed them found difficult to interpret. They were not reckless. They were not suicidal. They were men who had learned through repeated experience that the tactical calculation behind the training was correct, that keeping moving was more survivable than stopping, and who had built their understanding of danger around that knowledge rather than around the ordinary instincts that civilians and fresh soldiers brought to the battlefield. They were, in a specific and observable sense, dangerous in a way that their German opponents increasingly recognized and increasingly found difficult to counter.
There is a forest in western Germany called the Hürtgen. It covers roughly 50 square miles of dense fir trees in the hills near the Belgian and German border, and between September of 1944 and February of 1945, a series of American divisions were sent into it, one after another, and were consumed. The Hürtgen Forest was where American fire and movement doctrine encountered the one terrain for which it had not been designed and which it could not adapt to quickly enough. The fir trees were old and tall, their canopy dense enough to reduce daylight to a permanent gray twilight, their trunks close enough to channel any movement into narrow lanes that were themselves prepared defensive positions. The forest floor was covered in a network of interlocking German fortifications, pillboxes, bunkers, minefields, pre-registered artillery targets that had been built over months and that were almost invisible until you were on top of them. Every advantage American fire and movement doctrine gave in open country was negated in the Hürtgen. You could not maneuver through dense fir trees in the way the doctrine required. Fire teams could not maintain visual contact with each other. The distances at which the tactic worked, ranges at which your volume fire could actually suppress a German position, collapsed to 10 or 20 meters in forest where you couldn't see 10 or 20 meters in any direction. And the trees created a new hazard that compounded everything else. When artillery rounds hit fir trees, they detonated in the canopy rather than the ground, sending lethal splinters in every horizontal direction. Soldiers who would have been safe in a shell crater in open ground were exposed to tree bursts even when lying flat. The safest place to be in a Hürtgen artillery barrage was standing upright against the trunk of a large tree, which was also the position most exposed to the direct fire of anyone who could see you. American units entered the Hürtgen believing the doctrine would work because the doctrine had been working. They had fought through France and Belgium using fire and movement and marching fire, and the combination had carried them across hundreds of miles of European countryside. The forest stripped all of that away and left them with a close-range infantry fight in which the terrain itself was the primary obstacle, and in which no tactical sophistication could be brought to bear against fortifications you couldn't see until you were in their field of fire. The 28th Infantry Division went in. The 4th Infantry Division went in. The 1st Infantry Division went in. Portions of multiple other divisions were fed in at various points. The casualties across the entire Hürtgen campaign were somewhere in the region of 30,000 Americans killed, wounded, or captured, more than the total in the Normandy breakout, concentrated in 50 square miles of forest in the matter of months. The German defenders of the Hürtgen did not win because they defeated the American tactical system. They won because the terrain made the American tactical system inapplicable. The forest was not a test of one doctrine against another. It was a test of what happens when a well-designed system is forced to operate in conditions that negate its fundamental assumptions. American units in the Hürtgen did not fail because their soldiers lacked courage or their officers lacked skill. They failed because they were asked to execute a tactic that required room to maneuver in a place where there was none, that required visual contact between fire teams in a place where visibility was measured in yards, and that required the ability to suppress enemy positions before moving toward them in a place where enemy positions were invisible until they opened opened fire. The men who survived the Hürtgen carried something different back from it than men who had fought in France. They had seen the doctrine fail. They had been in a place where walking forward was genuinely suicidal, not because the tactical principle was wrong, but because the conditions that made it true had been removed. That specific knowledge that the system had limits, that there were places and conditions in which the training was not enough, was its own kind of weight. The German officer corps by 1944 was not comprised of stupid men. They had won extraordinary victories in the first 4 years of the war, using a system of tactical thinking that had produced some of the most brilliant small unit combat the modern era had seen. They were not losing in Normandy because they didn't understand war. They were losing, in part, because the army they were fighting had built something specific to defeat the thing they did best. The MG-42 was a devastating weapon when you went to ground in front of it. The German defensive doctrine, built around the machine gun, organized to suppress enemy movement and then counterattack into the suppressed position, worked perfectly when the enemy did what suppressed infantry were supposed to do. When American units kept moving, the calculation broke down in specific ways that German after-action reports noted with increasing frequency and frustration across the summer and autumn of 1944. The first problem was the volume of fire coming from advancing American squads. The MG-42 was an extraordinary weapon, but it required its gunner to be able to raise his head and use his sights, and a squad advancing with 2 BARs firing and 8 riflemen also firing created an environment in which raising your head above a defensive position was a genuinely dangerous activity. It wasn't that the fire was accurate, it often wasn't. It was that the density of it, the number of rounds passing through the space above a German defensive position per second, made staying up long enough to aim a disciplined return shot increasingly costly. The second problem was the pace. German defensive doctrine anticipated that suppressed infantry would stop moving while suppressed. Stopping gave the defensive position time to adjust, to shift fire, to call for support, to do all the things a prepared defensive position was designed to do. American infantry that kept walking gave the defensive position much less time to do any of those things. The distance closed faster. The moment at which the advancing soldiers were close enough to use grenades came faster. The moment at which the defensive position became untenable, too close, too much fire, too many men in too many directions at once, came faster. The third problem, and the one that appears most consistently in German accounts of fighting Americans in this period, was psychological. There is something specifically demoralizing about an enemy that does not respond to fire the way every military instinct says he should. When you open fire on a group of soldiers and they go to ground, you have confirmed the basic transaction of the battlefield. Fire is dangerous. Fire changes behavior. Fire controls movement. When you open fire on a group of soldiers and they keep walking toward you, something more unsettling happens. The enemy has failed at its primary purpose. The enemy has absorbed the fact of it and kept coming. The psychological weight of that, of an enemy that your best weapon has not stopped, is disproportionate to the tactical reality. It produces hesitation. It produces doubt. and hesitation and doubt in the split-second decisions of close-range infantry combat are often the difference between a defensive position that holds and one that breaks. This was the thing that the German intelligence officer in that Normandy farmhouse had noticed and had written a single underlined word about. The Americans weren't walking into fire because they were brave in some simple, unconsidered way. They weren't walking into fire because they didn't understand what was happening. They were walking into fire because someone had worked out years earlier that walking into fire while also firing was more survivable than going to ground in front of it, and had built an entire system of training and squad organization to make that insight executable. The deliberateness of it was what mattered, not the courage, which could be explained and even discounted, the system behind it. Systems were harder to defeat than courage.
What does it mean that the most counterintuitive tactic of the war actually worked? It means, at one level, that military effectiveness is often not about what feels right, but about what the mathematics of the specific situation actually reward. The mathematics of a firefight, the relationship between movement and time in the kill zone, between volume of fire and enemy ability to aim, between the pace of an assault and a defender's ability to respond, are not intuitive. They don't map neatly onto the instincts that evolution and experience give to an ordinary person under fire. The Army had done the work of figuring out those mathematics and had built a training system to install them in soldiers who would have to use them in conditions where instinct was screaming the opposite instruction. It means, at another level, that the history of tactics is largely a history of attempts to solve specific problems created by specific weapons and specific terrain, and that solutions which work in one context fail in another. Marching fire worked in the open fields of France and the rolling country of Germany because those environments had room for maneuver, because suppressive fire could travel the distances required, because the system's assumptions were satisfied by the conditions. The Hürtgen showed what happened when the assumptions were stripped away. The doctrine was not wrong. The doctrine was a solution to a specific problem, and the Hürtgen was a different problem. It means, perhaps most importantly, that the professional soldiers on both sides of this war were engaged in something genuinely intellectual, not merely a contest of courage and firepower, but a running argument about how to organize violence effectively, conducted with human lives as the stakes, and with real-time feedback from the battlefield determining who was right. The German intelligence officer with his pencil was doing what serious soldiers do, looking at the evidence, following it where it led, and recording what he found with as much honesty as he could manage. His annotation has been used as evidence of German surprise, of German confusion, of the moment the Wehrmacht confronted something it hadn't prepared for. All of those readings are correct as far as they go, but the most honest reading is simpler than any of them. The word deliberate meant that the Americans knew what they were doing. They had thought about it, built a system around it, trained soldiers to execute it under fire. They were not winning by accident. That is the thing about the men who walked upright toward German machine guns across the fields of France and Germany in 1944 and 1945. Their courage was real. The fear they overcame was real. The doctrine behind them, the manuals, the training, the squad organization, the tactical logic, was also real, and it was built by people who had thought harder about the problem of infantry combat than most of the people who would later write popular accounts of the war. The soldiers didn't know most of that. They knew the training, they knew the man next to them, they knew the fire was real, and they kept walking. The system worked partly because of them, and partly because the people who had designed the system had done their homework.
That combination, a system built by people who thought carefully, executed by men who had enough confidence in the training to override the scream of their own instincts, is what the German intelligence officer was looking at when he picked up his pencil and wrote his single underlined word, deliberate. There is a postscript that belongs to this story, and it is a quiet one. The doctrine survived the war. The 5-paragraph orders survived the war. The squad organization, the fire team concept, the trained insistence on maintaining movement under fire, all of it was carried forward into the Army that emerged in 1945 and became the foundation of how American infantry was trained for the next several decades. The men who walked upright through French fields came home and became something the peacetime army did not always know what to do with. Veterans who had tested a system under the worst possible conditions and come back with knowledge that no manual could fully convey. Some of them became sergeants and drill instructors and training officers, and they passed something on that was harder to write down than any tactical doctrine. The specific embodied understanding that the training was right, the instinct was wrong, that you kept walking. The German intelligence officer's annotation ended up archived somewhere in the captured document collections of a defeated army. The knowledge it described, the deliberateness, the system, the trained override of the survival instinct, went home in the bodies and minds of the men who had used it. That is not a dramatic ending. It is the way most of the real work of war ends, not in a surrender ceremony or a headline, but in the quiet continuation of something that worked, carried forward by the people who survived it into a world that had already begun to forget how much it had cost to build. He was right. It was deliberate, and it was, in the end, one of the things that decided the war. If the idea that the outcome of the greatest conflict in human history turned partly on training manuals and squad organization and the calculated decision to keep walking when every instinct says to stop, if that is the kind of history that makes you think differently about what you thought you knew, subscribe. That is genuinely the whole reason this channel exists. These stories live in the details, and the details are almost always more interesting than the headline.